organizing this event and for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I would like to begin by remembering the victims of past atrocities as we commemorate the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. As you know, previous speakers have said that starting on April 24th, 1915, over 1.5 million Armenians living under the Ottoman Empire were targeted and killed during mass killings and mass deportation. In a historic move, on Saturday, US President Joe Biden formally recognized that the atrocities against the Armenian people constituted a genocide. While this acknowledgement is largely symbolic, a recognition of the crime of genocide can prevent its recurrence. Acknowledging that genocides and atrocities have been committed against a certain population is a first step towards securing justice for survivors and victims. It is also a first step towards acknowledging the patterns of structural discrimination that exist in a society that could then lead to genocide and commission of other atrocity crimes. So if we diagnose a problem correctly, then finding solutions to address it become easier. Whereas denial aggravates the injuries of the past and sows the seeds for future injustices. Acknowledging the truth and learning from the past is crucial to create a collective understanding of how the international community should uphold its responsibility to protect prosecuted populations today. So, in solidarity with the Armenian people, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect calls on all UN member states to officially recognize the Armenian genocide and end once and for all a century of indifference and denial, because only by learning from the past can we build a better future. But at an event like this, 106 years after such a terrible moment in the history of the Armenian people, we also need to assess our collective ability to end similar suffering today. Around the world, more than 80 million people are currently displaced by conflict, persecution, and atrocities. The vital work of humanitarian organization has never been more important. However, as Mr. Lowcock, the head of the UN Office for the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, said just last week, that humanitarian agencies can only ever respond to the symptoms of global crises. We can alleviate the suffering caused by the crises, but we cannot stop them from happening. And Mr. Lowcock is right, as we all know. We all know that today's humanitarian crises will not be solved by blankets and bandages alone. Conflict now drives 80% of all humanitarian needs. Therefore, humanitarian efforts aimed at emergency assistance for victims of conflict are no substitute for policies that are aimed at building long-term political solutions. Given that most of the large-scale humanitarian crises today have arisen from the situations of mass atrocity crimes being perpetrated, solutions to address the current crises lie in upholding political norms like the responsibility to protect. The rhetoric of prevention is prolific in the UN, but speeches do not prevent atrocities, timely political action does. So here are some examples that will very starkly highlight the argument that I'm making. When Myanmar's military, the Tatmadaw, launched its so-called clearance operation in Rakhine State in August 2017 against the Rohingya populations, the international community's commitment to R2P was tested. During this time, the military committed crimes against humanity and war crimes in Rakhine State, as well as acts of genocide against the Rohingya population. The majority of the Rohingya population was forced to flee, risking their lives to cross over to Bangladesh. Because the humanitarian situation was so devastating with such enormous needs and with a deadlocked UN Security Council unable to respond to the crimes committed against the Rohingya, most states started characterizing the situation as a humanitarian crisis taking place in Bangladesh rather than viewing the crisis as an act of genocide perpetrated by the Tatmadaw. The conflict in Yemen is another shocking example. The conflict has displaced over 4 million people and created the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The dire humanitarian situation is a direct result of the way in which the conflict has been conducted. For years, civilians in Yemen have suffered from war crimes and crimes against humanity as the parties to the conflict, including the Saudi coalition and the Houthis, perpetrate indiscriminate attacks, target civilian infrastructure, and systematically block humanitarian aid. And sadly, the civilians will continue to bear the brunt of hostilities until the international community recognizes that the solutions to the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen is not just more aid, but more global political pressure on those who are waging this destructive war, those who are arming them, and those who protect their interests at the UN. In Ethiopia's Tigray region, there have also been widespread reports of crimes, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing since the armed hostilities broke out between the regional authorities and the federal government in late November. Amidst the ongoing conflict, the humanitarian situation has deteriorated. The majority of Tigray is inaccessible to aid agencies, and more than 5 million people are in need of assistance. For months, neither the African Union nor the UN Security Council has made any substantial progress towards mediating an end to the conflict or holding the perpetrators accountable. Despite the unfolding tragedy in Tigray, when the UN Security Council discussed the situation in Ethiopia during March, it was in the context of the debate on humanitarian assistance and food. Now, 6 months into the war, the UN Security Council finally issued a press statement on the situation on 22nd April, just last week, which again focuses primarily on the dire humanitarian situation in Tigray. And while the humanitarian needs are immense, the crisis cannot be solved with humanitarian solutions. This will require political action, a political situation, and legal accountability. As these three examples make clear, all too often in the world today, discussions on humanitarian needs and funding of humanitarian appeals have become an excuse for political inaction. Instead of taking bold steps to mediate the stop of the violence or to hold perpetrators of atrocities responsible for their actions, the UN Security Council, the UN Secretariat, the UN bodies, and relevant stakeholders often focus on humanitarian issues. In the multilateral sphere, viewing a crisis through a humanitarian lens is also seen as being apolitical and neutral, as a way to build consensus or secure access to a region or a regime. Yet, in reality on the ground, the delivery of humanitarian aid remains deeply political. I would go so far as to say that international community has become complicit in giving some perpetrators a free pass. In order to maintain consensus and an illusion of access, crises get characterized or diagnosed as humanitarian in nature, and as a result, the real issues at stake are conveniently overlooked. So, for example, the failure of the UN Security Council to adequately respond to the 2017 genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar has created a climate of impunity that the generals exploited. The February 1st coup is the price that the people of Myanmar are going to be paying for a very long time for the international community's failure to uphold human rights and to hold these generals accountable. I ask you, seriously, until how long does it take? How long it will be since we will be discussing the developing crisis in Myanmar currently as a humanitarian situation. So, as we commemorate the 106th anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian Genocide, it is right that we acknowledge the extraordinary humanitarian efforts undertaken by Armenians themselves, as the professor told us before, and by Americans who supported Near East relief and saved countless Armenian lives during and after the genocide. This was humanitarianism at its greatest, driven by ordinary people relying on human solidarity with people in a faraway land. But a century later, what have we learned? Now more than ever, the world needs to consistently uphold its responsibility to protect and work to prevent atrocities wherever and whenever they occur. The anniversary of the Armenian Genocide serves as a reminder from history that indifference and inaction should never be acceptable response to genocide. The, first, the most fitting memorial to the victims and survivors of the Armenian Genocide is that we end once and for all the systems of persecution, discrimination, and hate that are the precursors of genocide, and that we build institutions, organizations, and societies that place human rights and humanitarianism at the core of our value system. That is the real lesson from 1915. And sadly, it is a lesson that we still often ignore. Thank you very much.